So in the previous video, I had explained what is an API in a very beginner-friendly fashion. This is the video, and if you haven't seen this one, please check this video before going forward in this one. So coming inside today's video, which is the second part of the beginner API series, today we are going to see how to actually make an API request. Because in the previous one, we had understood what exactly are API requests and what exactly is an API, what is the procedure, what's the function, how exactly API work. But in today's video, we are going to do a practical demonstration of how to actually request something, some information via API, or send some information via API and get a response from a server. And as always, this whole presentation will be available absolutely free of cost for you as a PDF, so that if you want to use any of these in any of your works, you can just do it freely. Links would be in the description. Alright, starting with making an API request. The first section of this tutorial is going to be what exactly are the two methods that you have to learn through which we make an API call. Right? Although there are multiple methods, but these two are the ones that you should understand so that you can actually get 80% of the things done that are required to build any meaningful application on the top of any API. The two of those very important ones are called get and post. These are the names of those API requests. We call it a get request, and the second one is called post request. So as the name suggests, get request means that we want to retrieve some data, we want to get some data from an API, and the data is located to some server somewhere, and we have to access that data through an API call request. That process is called a get request. The opposite of that is a post request, in which we can send a data effectively to some server, or the process through which that data will get transmitted via an API would be called as a post request. And the tools we'll use for these operations would be Postman, which is the most popular API platform that is out there. If you don't know it yet, it's not a problem. I'm going to explain everything real soon. And the next one is a simple web browser get request. Because remember, I told you in the last video that get request can also be sent via web browsers by just simply putting that request inside the URL bar. Right? So I'll explain and I'll demonstrate both of these ways to do the same API call, and let's start with the basics. So remember, an API call is essentially a message sent to a server. It doesn't matter if it's a get or a post or any other kind of API call. It is actually a message sent to a server, and when that is done, we wait for a response from that server. Yeah, so the next point is the server then sends back a response. And the most important part of this whole process is we need to structure our message correctly. And remember in the last session that the structure in which we actually send our message is called JSON. Today we are going to actually practically use, and I'll show you how to use a JSON structure to send a message to an API via get or post. Right? So this is a graphical representation of how the API call cycle work. Right? So the first step is we send an API call. Second step is the server processes the request and we receive a response, and then the response is sent in a structured format, which is JSON. Right? Now let's go with the making a get request. That's the first part. Right? So what is this for? This particular API method is for retrieving the data. Right? How it works. First of all, you'll need the API's URL, or in API language, we call it an endpoint. Right? So not every service will have an API. For those who do, they will publish their API URLs or the endpoint in their documentation. You can search or Google any API documentation of any service, and if it is available, you will find a list of API URLs, which is also called the endpoint. I'll just show you how that looks, but let's move forward. Sometimes you'll need to add parameters to the URL to specify what data you want. Those look like question mark key equal value. Sometimes if you even do a Google search and you hit the search button, the first URL you put in is google.com. But when you put any search query inside the google.com website, you will find that the URL has changed to something like this. Let me show you. So we go to google.com and let's say we say documentation, right? Now, if we see the URL, the URL has been changed to search $q equal to whatever we had searched. So that's the same concept that I'm telling you here, that this, what we just made, was a GET request to Google's servers, right? And Google's servers displayed all this data back via API in the backend, right? And this is exactly what we are trying to do right here, right? Example is, imagine an API that gives a random cat facts, right? So let's say we go to this URL, and this is a random cat fact that is displayed when we actually open the URL. And when we open the URL, that means that we are sending a GET request to this URL's server via API. If I refresh this, we'll have a different cat fact, right? If I refresh it again, like this, so every single refresh is sending a new GET request to this website's server, and we are getting a response. And this is the process of how the GET API request works. Let me demonstrate this with another visual example. Okay, so this is a free dog API, right, in which we can put in GET request via this URL, or in API terms, this is called an endpoint. So you can figure out that the first part of this is the website's URL, the second part is API, then it's breed, then image, and then random. And the whole thing is called an API endpoint. So if I do a fetch, I'll simply be doing a GET request to the dog.ceo servers, and it will give me some response, right? And I'll show you what that means. So if I click fetch, you see the image has changed. If I do fetch again, image has changed. If I do fetch again, image has changed, right? And on the left, we see a JSON. This is actually how we are communicating with the API servers. And remember, I told you the communication language or the format of all the communication and request we'll do in API world is always going to be JSON, right? So this says that the message we received is this particular image file, which you can see right here, and the status is success. We'll come to status codes later in this video, but this JSON has two parts. One is message and one is status, and that is going to be same for every single request. I mean, this link would change every single time, but the structure would remain the same, right? Just verify this. Fetch once again, the image has changed, the structure remains the same. Fetch once again, image has changed, right? So this is a very basic building block of how a GET request works. Moving on. Right, so we just use the browser for our GET request, right? So when we click the fetch button, every single time the browser was sending a request, which is a GET request, to the server, and we were getting a response in JSON format, right? The next, or an alternate way to do, or an advanced way to do the same thing would be using Postman, right? So let me show you what Postman is. You go to postman.com, you will be greeted with Postman website. A Postman simply is an API client which lets you request any kind of API to any kind of API server, right? So let's say we do a new request. This is called a send an API request right here, and we do a new request. Now you see the default section says get, and it says enter a URL or paste a text. So the simplest and the easiest, or the first step that Postman is inviting us to do is a GET request to any API endpoint, right? Let's try to do it. So we go back to dog API and we copy this URL, right? And we go back to Postman and we paste this URL right here, and we click on send. And as soon as we hit send, we are getting this particular response back, right? And to see what this actually is in visual format, we just command and click, and we'll be getting this particular thing as a result, right? If we do send again, we'll have another different URL, and if we know what that is this one, right? So this is exactly the same method that we were doing on that web page, which was this. Here it was graphical and it was through the browser, but here it was through Postman, which is an advanced method, and this is the method that you will use in future to build or test any of your AI deployments or apps. So understand this is very important. Going back, moving on, next one is a post request, right? So now you have understood what a get request is. Now in the post request, we have to have sending data to a server, right? For example, creating a new user form or submitting a form, right? For that, we'll have to have the API's URL. You'll need to send data in the body of the request, usually in JSON format, and the JSON would look like this, right? So let me show you an example. So this is just a free API that enables us to do any of these requests for random things, right? So this can be a good example of how to do a post API, because otherwise we have to make a server and we have to test it out. Just for simplicity, I'm just using a pre-made and a free API that enables us to process a post request, right? So right here, we'll come to post and it says the endpoint would be this and the format of the request should be this. Let me show you how this works. So let me make it side by side. Right. So what we'll do is this, any URL that you will see in any API docs is going to be the endpoint, right? So we copy this endpoint and we paste it right here. And very important part is we have to change this to post. Like I told you, there are many other API kinds of requests, but for now you can just focus on these two, and that is enough for you to understand and make some starter AI apps on top of this, right? So we'll do post. Now, if I do send right now, it will give me an error, this one, because remember, it is very important that we follow the structure of how the API is formatted to receive the requests, right? And in this one, the structure is like this, so the first field has to be ID, second field has to be name, then the data, right? So we'll copy this whole thing and we have to paste it where? We have to paste it in the body section, right? Now inside body, we have to go to raw and we have to just paste it like this, right? So this is the format which is accepted by this particular server of the post request. Now we can change any of this and this will be an accepted post request to this API. So let's change this one to, let's say, my name, and year should be, let's say, 2030. Price should be whatever. And we can put any data, like we can put method and we can put as YouTube channel, and let's keep this as the same, doesn't matter. So when we now click send, this is giving us the data that the response was accepted and this particular data field has been injected into this server via API. We didn't have to go to any UI or any web page. We can simply do all of these injections and requests through this one panel of the backend API. And imagine you can automate this stuff. So let's say you have 1,000 records to enter into any form and you don't want to invest manual time and labor to go to a website and load the UI and then do that. You simply automate this stuff and this API request will enter one record in that table or that form, and you can automate this whole process to just save your time and effort. And that is the true power of API, because we can do the same things that somebody can do via the UI or the web interface, but we can do everything in the backend with just text and few lines of JSON code, right? I hope this is clear. Let's move on. Right, so I think this is all clear because I just showed you how to do it. You can read this again and just understand the steps taken. Now the key points for beginners is start with get. Like I told you, the first thing I taught you was the get request, because that's the easiest one to understand, right? Second one is use Postman. Like again, I told you that Postman is going to be your friend in future, because that is a very robust and advanced platform to do all kinds of API testing and deployment, right? Third thing is pay attention to response, right? Now, I'll tell you a lot more about response just in a minute, but we had a response of 200, which is okay. So these are response codes, which I'm going to tell you right now. But understand that response is something that you have to keep your eye on when you do any kind of request. When you hit the send button, whatever you do, you will always get a response back. That response usually is in green or 200, which is the code for OK. Otherwise, you can have various responses, and depending upon the code of the response, you can figure out what errors might be there in your request, right? So, and the last one is read the API documentation, because every single API server will have their own structure, their own documentation, and you have to follow that exactly. If you even mistake one comma, one bracket, you will get an error. That is a negative point of sending request via code or via Postman, because code understands 0 or 1. If it is not exact documentation following syntax, it will just throw an error, right? So this is a graphical representation of this text, and here we come for status codes, which I just showed you right here. This is a status code, right? So you can just remember or print this diagram out, because when you keep doing this stuff, you will involuntarily remember what all status code means, right? Right now it might be too overwhelming to see all of these different status codes, but trust me, with practice, with time, you will eventually figure out what code means what, right? So these are just 1 2 3 4 5 simple 5 series of codes. So if you have some code which starts with 1, it doesn't matter what the other two digits are, right? It means that the request was received and it's in the process. Sometimes there are too many requests queued in an API server, and if you get this 1xx format of status code, it means it's still processing. There is not a problem. You are in the queue, right? Second one is 2 and something. 200 is success, or 2xx, whatever. If it starts with 2, that's a good news. Like this, if it starts with 2 and it's 200, it's okay. So 2 is your friend, right? 3 is redirection, which means the API endpoint you're using is redirected to some other place, and you have to do something with your request to cater to that redirection. So 3 series of status codes is redirection. 4 series of status codes is when problem starts coming in, because usually 404 is what the not found error is. So 4 series is called client errors, and client is you who is sending the request. Something is off at your point. You might have misplaced something, you might have mistyped something, or there was some error at your end. Server is fine, API request is fine, but there is something wrong in your request pattern, or the JSON code, or the body, or the payload, whatever, right? 5 series errors are server errors, right? So this is where something is wrong inside the server. Your API request is correct, the API process is correct, but the server is having a hiccup, or there are some problems inside servers. So this is very important to understand, and you will get to know this by heart when you start doing things, because usually these are the usual error codes that you will get 90% of the times. So you will get 400, which is a bad request, which means server couldn't understand your request. It's often due to incorrect syntax or missing data. So like you might have missed a comma, or have not followed the documentation to the T, right? 401 is unauthorized, because you are trying to access some protected source, which requires username and password, or an API key which you have not entered. 403 is forbidden, which means you're authenticated but you don't have access to that level of API. Some APIs only offer get requests and not post, for example. So if you try to do a post request even with the correct credentials, you will get a forbidden error. 404 is not found. That's simple. 429 is too many requests. Too many people are trying to get an API answer from the server at one time, so server is just busy, right? 500 is internal server error, which means a server crash or a bug in API's code, right? So you can just this is a shortcut and short diagram to all these API codes, which are usually what you will encounter 90% in your API testing or deployment. Now, why these codes matter? These codes matter because If you want to debug a particular API or an error, you can simply look up these codes and figure out very quickly what is wrong. If these codes were not present and everything was just a simple error, it's going to be very hard to figure out what the error was, right? So these codes are going to be very beneficial for you to figure out what exact error was and how do you fix it, right? Error handling, exactly what I explained to you, and API, and this helps you in your API usage, right? Then the last thing is tips for beginners. Whenever you encounter an error, always check the status code first, right? This is why I press so much on learning these codes, right? Refer to API's documentation for specific details about error codes and how to resolve them, right? Use tools like Postman to examine the full response, which often includes more detailed error messages, right? So like we did here, if we don't do this and we just click send, we'll get a 400 or bad request. Now let's go back to our document. What was 400? 400 was bad request, check request syntax and data completeness. So in this section, we didn't pass any data in the body. That is why it is a 400, which immediately tells me that something is wrong in my JSON body, which I'm sending in as a payload in the post request, right? So this is how quickly you can figure out what the error was just by looking at the error code, right? So I hope this was useful. I'll put some links to free API sources that you can just play around and test out by just obtaining an API key and then try out get request, post request, and figure out how these things work. And if you have any more questions, drop in your comments and stay tuned for the next one in this Building with AI API series for beginners. And you know what to do? Subscribe.